How ancient civilizations managed debt and financial crises. Imagine this. You wake up in the heart of Babylon. The sun rises over massive ziggurats. Merchants are shouting in the streets. Silver and barley flow through markets like rivers of wealth. But you are drowning, not in water, but in debt. The harvest failed. The creditor is at your door. If you cannot pay, your wife and children may be taken into slavery. But suddenly, the king speaks. With one decree, he wipes away every debt in the land. Contracts burned, tablets smashed, slaves walking free. Overnight, the poor rise again and the balance of power resets. Sound impossible? It happened. Not once, but many times across civilizations. From Babylon to Egypt, from Israel to Greece, from Rome to China. Ancient rulers discovered that if debt is not managed, if financial crises are ignored, entire empires will fall. And tonight, we're going to uncover the forgotten money rules, the secrets of debt and wealth the ancients used to survive collapse. Secrets we've ignored at our own peril. Because here's the truth. Every empire in history has faced a debt crisis. And every empire that failed to manage it collapsed. One, Babylon and Mesopotamia. Our journey begins in the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. Here, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the first cities rose, the first armies marched, and the first debts were recorded. Clay tablets, inscribed by reed styluses, carry the earliest financial records humanity has ever known. Numbers carved into wet clay, names of farmers, merchants, priests, and soldiers. Debts of barley, debts of silver, debts that bound lives together like invisible chains. But Mesopotamian kings learned quickly that unchecked debt was dangerous. Too dangerous. When harvest failed, families sank deeper into obligation. A farmer could not pay his lender. So he pledged his land, then his tools, then his children. Debt slavery spread like a disease. Soon, the very workers who tilled the land, the men who defended the city walls, the women who wove cloth for trade, were chained by creditors. If left unchecked, society itself would collapse. And so, the kings of Mesopotamia discovered something radical, something modern economies rarely dare consider. They called amargye freedom, a debt cancellation. Around 2400 BC, in the city of Lagash, King Urukagina proclaimed the first known debt jubilee. All debts erased, all debt slaves set free, the poor restored to their homes. This was not generosity, it was survival. A king who failed to protect his people from debt would face riots, desertion, and revolt. Later, Hammurabi, the great lawgiver, took this principle even further. His code of laws did not just regulate contracts and punishments. It set strict limits on debt. Interest rates were capped. Creditors were forbidden from seizing essential tools of farming. If a flood destroyed a farmer's crop, the king's law required creditors to forgive his debt for that season. Hammurabi understood debt could fuel trade, but if allowed to enslave the people, it would destroy the kingdom. Think about that. Nearly 4,000 years ago, rulers knew what our world forgets, that financial systems without mercy eventually devour themselves. And so, every generation or two, Mesopotamian kings would proclaim, the debts are canceled, the slaves are free, the land returns. To the wealthy creditors, it was outrageous. To the poor, it was salvation. To the king, it was survival. This is the first hidden law of ancient wealth. No economy can survive if debt is allowed to crush its people. S2. Egypt, the grain banks. Now we sail down the Nile, the river that gave life to Egypt. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt's wealth was measured not in silver, but in grain. Every year, the Nile's floods left behind rich black soil. When the waters rose high, fields overflowed with abundance. When the floods failed, famine stalked the land. Pharaohs, with wisdom both practical and divine, built vast storehouses, granaries the size of palaces. In times of plenty, grain was stored. In times of famine, it was released. This was more than food security. It was financial control. When a poor farmer ran out of grain, he could borrow from the state stores. But the loan carried interest. If he could not repay, he sank into debt bondage. Families pledged themselves as laborers, generations chained by a single failed harvest. But here lies Egypt's genius. The pharaoh controlled both the debt and the relief. By releasing grain during famine, the state prevented uprisings. By collecting repayment during abundance, the state grew richer. Egypt's granaries were, in truth, the world's first central banks. Even in the famous story of Joseph in the Bible, we see this system at work. 7 years of plenty, grain stored. 7 years of famine, grain released, sold, loaned. When the famine deepened, people sold their land, their livestock, even themselves to Pharaoh. By the end, Pharaoh controlled nearly all of Egypt's wealth. Debt was not just an accident of famine. It was a tool of power. The lesson of Egypt is this: debt can be used to enslave or to stabilize. It depends on who controls the storehouse. Pause, leaning into suspense. And as we leave Egypt, we step into a land whose laws took debt management to an even more radical extreme: ancient Israel. 3. Ancient Israel, the Jubilee Law. Now we step into the hills of ancient Israel. Shepherds graze their flocks. Farmers tend vineyards, and priests guard the sacred scrolls of the law. Here we find one of the most radical financial systems in history. A command written not by kings, but by God himself, or so the people believed. It was called the Jubilee Year. Every 50 years, trumpets sounded across the land. A proclamation went forth. All debts are forgiven. All slaves are set free. All land returns to its family. Imagine the power of that moment. A man whose father lost his vineyard 40 years ago suddenly walks back onto his ancestral soil. A slave, born in bondage, steps into freedom. Entire families rise from despair, restored by divine decree. Why such a radical law? Because the God of Israel knew the dangers of unchecked debt. In the Torah, the book of Leviticus declares, "The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine." In other words, wealth was never meant to be hoarded endlessly by a few. Debt was never meant to enslave generations. The Jubilee was not just economic, it was spiritual. It reminded the people that wealth was temporary, that freedom was sacred, and that no man should rule another forever through debt. Think about it. What would happen if modern nations declared a Jubilee today? If every mortgage, every student loan, every credit card balance vanished? Who would cheer? Who would resist? The ancients were not afraid of such resets. They knew that without them, society would rot from within. This is the second hidden law of ancient wealth. Debt must be balanced by mercy, or it will destroy the nation. For Greece, Solon and debt slavery. From the sacred hills of Israel, we cross the sea to ancient Athens, the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and theater. But before Athens became the jewel of Greece, it was drowning in crisis, not from war, but from debt. By the 6th century BC, the wealthy aristocrats had seized nearly all the land. The poor, unable to pay their debts, pledged their property, their freedom, even their children. Entire families became slaves to creditors. Athens stood on the brink of civil war. The poor demanded relief. The rich refused. The city teetered toward collapse. And then came Solon. Solon was not just a poet and statesman. He was a reformer who dared to break the chains of debt. In 594 BC, he introduced the Sysaxia, literally, the shaking off of burdens. Debts were canceled. Debt slaves were freed. The practice of pledging one's body as collateral was abolished forever. It was a radical move, but it saved Athens. The city breathed again. Farmers returned to their land. Hope returned to the people. But Solon did more than cancel debts. He restructured society. He gave political rights to more citizens, laying the foundation for democracy itself. Think about that. Without debt relief, Athens may never have given birth to democracy, philosophy, or the golden age of Greece. Debt reform was not just economics. It was the spark of freedom. And yet, history shows us something chilling. Within a few generations, the same cycle repeated. Wealth concentrated. Debt returned. Slavery threatened again. The Greeks learned what every civilization learns. Debt can be erased once, twice, but unless its root is managed, it always returns. Voice softens, suspenseful. And so, we march onward toward the mightiest empire of them all, Rome, a civilization of laws, legions, and glory, yet one that nearly destroyed itself under the crushing weight of debt. 5. Rome, debt, riots, and Caesar's gamble. Now we arrive in Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. An empire of marble roads, aqueducts, mighty legions, and iron discipline. But beneath the glory of Rome lay a festering wound, debt. From the earliest days of the Republic, Roman citizens found themselves chained by creditors. Soldiers returned from war only to discover their farms seized by lenders. Families sank into bondage. The poor grew restless. Debt was not a side issue in Rome. It was a fault line that shook the Republic again and again. As early as 494 BC, the plebeians, the common people, rose in protest. They marched out of the city, seceding from Rome itself, refusing to fight in the legions until their debts were lifted. Imagine that. The Republic itself paralyzed by debt. Time and again, debt riots broke out. Creditors demanded payment. The poor demanded relief, and the Senate trembled. Laws were passed, interest rates reduced, but the cycle returned. By the time of Julius Caesar, debt was not just a problem. It was a crisis that threatened the very survival of Rome. Caesar, ever the strategist, saw opportunity. He knew the masses were drowning. He knew the elites were clinging to power. So he made a gamble. In 49 BC, during his rise to power, Caesar enacted sweeping debt reforms. He reduced the value of outstanding loans, capped interest, and forced wealthy creditors to accept partial losses. He redistributed land to veterans and the poor, to his enemies in the Senate. This was dangerous populism. To the people, it was salvation. Debt had become more than economics. It was politics, and Caesar used it as a weapon. By relieving the people's burdens, he secured their loyalty. By striking at creditors, he enraged the elite. Some historians even argue that Caesar's assassination was not only about power, but about money. His enemies could not forgive a man who threatened their wealth. Rome's story teaches us this. Debt is not just numbers on a ledger. It is the power to make or unmake empires. For all Rome's glory, debt cracked its foundations. Again and again, it forced riots, reforms, and revolutions. And in the end, no law, no legion, no emperor could fully master it. And yet, far across the world, other civilizations wrestle with the same shadow. In China and India, too, wise rulers sought ways to tame the fire of debt before it consumed their people. 6. China and India, forgotten lessons. Far from Rome, across deserts and mountains, we arrive in China, a land of emperors and dynasties, of jade palaces and paper scrolls. Here, the rulers face the same enemy that haunted Babylon and Rome: debt. Peasants, burdened by taxes and bad harvests, sank into loans. Moneylenders grew rich, while villages grew restless. And the emperors knew, an empire of unrest is an empire on the edge of collapse. And so, at times, Chinese rulers took drastic steps. They canceled debts. They freed peasants from crushing interest. They regulated lending to prevent usury. Confucian scholars taught that harmony could not exist if wealth was hoarded by the few while the many suffered. Usury, they said, was not only unfair, it was destructive to the balance of society. One saying in Confucian tradition warns, if wealth does not flow, disaster will. In other words, money was meant to circulate, not chain people in bondage. Now we travel further into India. Here, in the ancient treatise known as the Arthashastra, a manual of statecraft written over 2,000 years ago, we find remarkable wisdom about debt and money. The text advises kings to carefully regulate lending, to reduce interest during times of famine or war, and to protect farmers from predatory creditors. Why? Because farmers were the backbone of the kingdom. If they collapsed, the whole realm would starve. It was pragmatic, even ruthless, advice, not born from charity, but from survival. An empire could not stand if its farmers were enslaved to debt. Both China and India echo the same pattern we've seen again and again. Debt can enrich the few, but if left unchecked, it tears apart the many. And when the many fall, so too does the empire. Voice slow, suspenseful. Babylon, Egypt, Israel, Greece, Rome, China, India, all different. And yet, all discover the same dangerous truth. Debt is fire, useful if controlled, destructive if not. And now, as we approach the end of our journey, we must ask, what is the hidden law they all shared? What wisdom about debt and wealth did they leave behind for us to rediscover? 7. Suspenseful revelation. We have walked through the markets of Babylon, the grain banks of Egypt, the sacred laws of Israel, the reforms of Greece, the riots of Rome, the wisdom of China, and the strategies of India. Different lands, different gods, different empires, and yet they all discovered the same truth. Debt is not merely economic. It is social, political, and spiritual. If debt is allowed to enslave the many, the entire civilization collapses. If debt is balanced with mercy, with resets, with wisdom, society survives. This is the hidden law of ancient wealth. Debt must be managed like fire. Controlled, it gives life. Unchecked, it burns down empires. The ancients were not afraid to cancel debts, to reset the system, to start again. They knew that contracts and numbers were nothing compared to the survival of the people. And yet, today we live in a world where global debt is measured in the hundreds of trillions, where nation companies and families drown in obligations, where mercy is rare and debt is eternal. Are we repeating the mistakes of Babylon, the slavery of Greece, the riots of Rome? The ancients are whispering to us from the dust. Remember, reset, balance, or fall. The wisdom of debt is not about money. It is about survival. And history warns us. No empire, no matter how mighty, survives when its people are crushed by debt. So I ask you, what do you think will happen to our world, our nations, our lives if we continue down this path? The ancients left us warnings, laws, and hidden wealth principles. Secrets buried in scrolls, etched in stone, whispered by prophets and kings. And here, on this channel, we bring those secrets back to light. If you want to uncover more of this forbidden wisdom, if you want to understand the money rules kings live by, the financial secrets that built empires and destroyed them, then subscribe to Ancient Wealth. Because in the wisdom of the past lies the key to surviving the future. This is Ancient Wealth, and the secrets are waiting.